Last month, a storm bore down on our small town, thick clouds roiling in a way that felt almost foreboding. It felt like that storm had crept right into my neighbor Lisa's home, too, when she staggered over to my porch, eyes wide and disheveled, clutching her phone like it was a hot coal. "I think I need to go to the hospital," she gasped, her voice a mix of desperation and fear, but it wasn't the words that sent a shiver down my spine, it was the way she said it, as though she was trying so hard to keep it together but knowing her grip on reality was slipping. I could see her young son, Thomas, peeking from behind the screen door, those big, innocent eyes wide with confusion, and suddenly that shiver transforming into a full-blown shudder as I imagined how scared he must be at that moment. What had started as a simple rainstorm turned into an unbearable weight swirling in my stomach. I hadn't had the best relationship with Lisa, she rarely reached out unless she needed something, and here she was, practically demanding I take care of Thomas just so she could feel free enough to leave. The storm rumbled ominously overhead, and I didn't want to find myself plunged into the chaos of her life, so I hesitated for a heartbeat too long before saying, but frankly, I couldn't even finish that one pathetic little word before she started begging, "Please, I've tried calling a babysitter, but they're all busy. I can't leave him. Not now." I could see that desperation and fear were mixing into a cocktail of urgency, and my insides twisted as I imagined the looming hospital visit, thoughts racing through my mind about what it might reveal. What if something terrible was going on? What if I said yes and it spiraled downward? I shook my head, feeling my resolve harden despite the fluttering anxiety in my chest. I told her, "I'm really sorry, Lisa, but I can't. I have plans." It wasn't a lie, my nerves had been frayed by last week's sleepless nights and the dreadful anxiety that came with the unknown. There was something inside me that whispered she'd find someone else, and while I pressed my lips together to silence it, it only amplified in the silence. Her face fell, anger momentarily flashing in those wild eyes before they pooled with tears, and just then as the wind picked up, a small rumble of thunder echoed in the distance, resonating the storm's resonance with her heartbreak. "You're a monster," she hissed, and although I sucked in a breath, ready to explain how I wasn't prepared for her chaos, the moment just shattered. "All I'm asking is for a few hours," she continued, her voice trembling. "What would you do in my place?" I realized this was no longer about me or my panic. I had to find what was beneath my refusal, what was the cost now that I had said it out loud. I could feel guilt creeping into the corners of my heart, coupling with my relentless anxiety. I had just locked myself out of something elemental. She twisted away from me, storm clouds roiling in her eyes as she retreated, that small hand of her son reaching for her, this sweet boy who didn't understand anything beyond a child's innocence. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I should have done more, that I would pay for my refusal. And just as I started to make amends with myself, an ominous message flashed on my phone very late one night. A simple text read, "Lisa was found." I felt an oppressive weight in my chest, burying me in doubt. The words "found" could mean anything, yet they stood stark against the solitude of night, intensifying my fear. I didn't even know how to process that, who to reach out to, or what else I might have caused when I had chosen my own comfort over that child in desperate need, the seed of anxiety sprouting into a relentless vine strangling my thoughts. I lost sleep, switched off my phone, and tried to quiet my mind as new pangs of remorse twisted inside. Until finally, the storm decision echoed back, shattering my solitude as I found the resolve to confront my cowardice. I trudged over to her house, the sky heavy with moisture, wind whipping at my clothes. I brought with me just a small bouquet I had cobbled together from my backyard. Upon reaching her home, though, dread built up the moment I caught sight of flashing lights against the windows, the police, their rigid figures silhouetted against the open door, spelling tragedy. A knot in my stomach deepened. I had worse fears about what had happened than I could admit. I stood rooted as I overheard snippets of a conversation. She was in some kind of state. "We'll get him out to safety," and in a shadowed corner of my mind, something thudded sickeningly as the implications crashed over me. I had known. I had known when I felt that chill in my gut, the heaviness of something grotesque awakening after I refused. Then, a small, familiar silhouette collided with my view. Thomas, hair tousled, eyes blurred with tears as he was led away, crying for his mother while the officers inspected his sad little figure. I could see the raw confusion wrapped around his expression like a shroud. I opened my mouth, but nothing emerged, my heart hammering in my chest as it dawned on me. She hadn't gone to the hospital because she needed to, she had been in an irreversible descent that I had just turned my back on, and that refusal now manifested a darkness I never anticipated, a helpless child standing dumbstruck in a storm of his own, and I froze under all the weight of it. The cries of a frightened boy saturated the evening air, buried deeper into a grisly storm of fate that had been intertwined with my choice, suffocating all rationality. A figure emerged, covering Thomas with a blanket, but all I could see were the words echoing back, reverberating inside me relentlessly, "AITA for refusing to look after a child." And in that haunting moment, as I stood paralyzed among the onlookers, I knew the answer clawing at my insides like an uncontained beast, leaving me ash-gray with dread as I began to understand. It was a fight I had already lost. Growing up, my life revolved around my older brother, Ethan. He was everything I was not: confident, funny, and entirely carefree in a way I could only dream of being, but that same carelessness always felt like a dark cloud over my life, looming and heavy, especially on that one fateful day. I remember it clearly. The air was thick with anticipation as my family prepared for our annual reunion, a day meant for laughter, connection, and cherished memories, but also for my inevitable disappointment because of Ethan, a disappointment I'd felt boil over countless times before when his habitual tardiness consistently disrupted our family plans. This time it was supposed to be different. I'd even gone to my parents, pleading with them to keep Ethan in check, laying out the timeline filled with the events we all cherished, hoping they would help me make him see how his actions twisted the knife of frustration further each time he shrugged off our schedules. Yet, there I stood in front of the mirror that morning, my dress pressed, hair shining, and excitement bubbling in my gut, only to watch the clock turn and tick away, seconds slipping like grains of sand as our family slowly turned into a collection of impatient whispers, glances towards the door, and hollowed cheers that fizzled into disappointment. When my parents finally conceded and called Ethan, laughing over the phone, unaware of how those jokes tarnished my heart, the hour melted into a torturous waiting game, each tick a reminder of my brother's disregard for the rest of us. Hours passed and my anxiety morphed into rage, those tantalizing minutes becoming a suffocating noose that tightened around my throat. Finally, with the sun dipping below the horizon, marking the decline of our day, Ethan strolled through the door, carrying a pizza under his arm as if the world had been waiting for that slice of mediocrity alone. I lost it, the mounting frustration bubbling over like a volcano ready to erupt, and I screamed, the sound echoing off the walls, "Why do you always do this? You ruin everything for me." I felt all eyes shift to me, the room stagnant with shock, my parents' expressions morphing from shock into disappointment, but it was Ethan who looked at me with a flicker of hurt, his usually disarming grin fading into a frown. Maybe he had never realized how his actions shaped my reality, but at that moment, I didn't care. As I stormed out of the room, I heard my mother's soft spelling out, "You're being absurd, he's just late," and my chest tightened as I reacted with such venom. Were they really siding with someone who consistently disregarded their family's time and affection for a pizza and a laugh? I had wanted to express my hurt, to convey my pain about existence revolving around his whims, but laying bare those feelings only backfired as familial ties drew tighter around my throat, all grappling with how to cope with a raging younger sister while cradling the fragile ego of a fragile brother. It was in that mounting tension I sought solace in my room, the darkness blanketing me like an old friend, but the shame curled around me like a boa constrictor squeezing its prey, leaving me gasping. I thought of the times he'd made me late for getting ready for school, missing birthdays, the heartbreak of years trickling behind us due to an indifference only he seemed immune to. It was hard to swallow as I replayed the image of our relatives sitting around the dining table, smiles stretched thin as they forever remembered Ethan's absence rather than my achievements. Night fell and I heard them talking softly downstairs, the murmurs reaching my ears, and I couldn't help but feel something teetering on the edge of my mind, a dreadful thought that perhaps my voice, no matter how loud, would always be drowned in the wake of my brother's presence, one that echoed through the halls like a menacing shadow. I spent the night lost in drowned thoughts, and when the morning sun broke through my window, I peeked into the family room, clutching the banister tightly, but there I found my parents, their faces drawn and worried, sat with an empty space beside them where Ethan used to be, and a weird knot twisted in my stomach at the sight. It was strange. Usually, he'd be bouncing in, giving fake apologies like breadsticks tossed onto a dinner plate, but now, my heart was riddled with dread as I approached them tentatively, wondering how far I'd pushed him, wondering if those late nights and hollow experiences had locked him in a place where he didn't belong. As I sat, on a seat that suddenly felt too big, the silence wrapped around my family thicker than ever, my mother finally broke the tension, her eyes glistening with tears. "Ethan left," and with those words hung heavy in the air, I realized how so much of our lives were measured in his tardiness, how selfish it all felt, and the confusion churned into a pang of guilt rendering me lost. I was supposed to confront him about the way he treated me, about the way his absence swallowed up my accomplishments, but here I sat weighted by emptiness instead. My brother's spirit lingered like fresh bread that had gone stale, something I could neither resent nor save. In the days that followed, the first miracle was the realization that distance unclogged the blindness I'd held, and as days turned to weeks flanked by his absence, I found myself grieving for a childhood adored but clouded with resentment. My parents would mention him in soft whispers around the dinner table, the empty space godding each family event, our laughter suddenly fractured and memories of late arrivals now shadowed by the grief of what once was, shaping me into someone more disappointed in myself than in my brother. A haunting solitude crawled deep inside, filling me with a wish to turn back time, to reclaim that day and take back my screams, to find a way that wouldn't isolate us further but instead would help bind us. And just as I thought that sealing the crack would mean unearthing the monstrous entity of my own anger, a simple envelope slipped under the door with my name written on it in familiar handwriting. My chest pounded as I read the lines scrawled out, each word carrying a weight of grief and regret as he explained that he had finally realized how his actions affected those around him. It was an apology wrapped in his desire to become a better brother, one tempted by the promise of solace, a lifeline begging me to respond. I couldn't believe it. He'd owned up to his carelessness while I had been stuck in my own tourniquet of anger. Somehow, our screams had turned into words, into hopes that rallied back light, sparking a chance to rebuild. Weeks passed, and it felt like trudging through thick mud as I made my way back to face what I couldn't bear to confront. Did I dare call him? Did I risk the fragile connection we still shared? Should I finally save my family from the echoes of what we once knew? The light of realization glimmered, a bright opportunity thrumming at my core, and one day, with trembling hands, I called him, and as our conversation unfolded like a fateful return, I finally understood. It wasn't about being perfect, it was about finding a way to share both the darkness and the dawn that came with having a brother, no matter how late he arrived. I still remember the night I found myself sitting in the dimly lit corner of that upscale restaurant, the air thick with the scent of rich herbs and roasted meats, a place that had been a favorite haunt for my wife and me since our early days of marriage. It was a peaceful evening, the clinking of silverware and hushed murmurs wrapping around us like a soft blanket, until I noticed him, a young man, perhaps in his early 20s, sitting 2 tables down, engaged in an animated conversation with his friends, his laughter piercing through the serenity like a jackhammer. After a couple of minutes, my frustration began to bubble as he leaned back in his chair, balancing precariously on the rear legs, treating the fine dining experience like a raucous college party. I exchanged glances with my wife, who was trying to enjoy her crème brûlée, but the escalating volume of the young man's voice was unbearable. He leaned back further, tilting the chair back grotesquely, and for a split second, I could swear he was trying to show off, perhaps reliving some frat party glory days in this place that felt far too classy for such antics. It was one thing to laugh and share a good time, but this felt disrespectful, a blatant disregard for the ambience meticulously crafted by the staff. I wouldn't have intervened if it weren't for that moment when he stood up, raising his arms above his head in what could only be described as a triumphant pose, as if celebrating the success of a prank, and I snapped. Without thinking, I leaned forward, my voice firm yet calm. "Could you sit down, please?" The sudden tension wrapped around us like a noose, his laughter fading and curiosity sparked in the eyes of other diners who glanced in our direction. The young man turned to me, a mixture of surprise and disdain washing over his features, and for a moment, I thought he might explode with that youthful arrogance that comes so easily in that age. Instead, he slowly lowered his arms and sank back into his chair, a pout forming as if I had stolen his spotlight. After a few seconds of incredulous silence, his friends erupted in laughter, mockery spilling out in waves, making the atmosphere thicker still. I could feel my ears burning with embarrassment, but I held my ground, silently staring back, until the waiter approached, an unsure smile on his face, and asked if everything was all right. My wife cleared her throat and gave me a look that screamed why. I smiled awkwardly, as if I were somehow the villain in this scene, but I justified my actions. Etiquette must be respected, right? I glanced back at the group and noticed something unsettling. The young man's eyes no longer met mine, but fixated on something behind me. I turned to look, half expecting to see an imposing figure, but there was just a shadow, a flicker of something, a person perhaps, but I shrugged it off as mere paranoia, the tension in the room seeming almost palpable. The young man, now quiet, seemed to sink into the moment, returning to his typical demeanor, but I noticed the flickers in his eyes were growing more ravenous, more unstable. I thought I had controlled the situation, but something felt off, the way he kept glancing around the restaurant now, not in embarrassment or irritation but with a strange, almost fearful curiosity. When he finally stood again, it was not for another triumphant show-off but rather a nervous fidget, and that's when the place grew quiet again, all eyes glued to him, waiting, and that included mine. He stepped away from the table, his friends still oblivious as they flirted with their cocktails, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he was drawn to the far corner of the restaurant, as if he sensed something lurking in the shadows. I leaned in toward my wife, whispering that something was strange, that I didn't like this, but she rolled her eyes, insisting I let it go. I couldn't. I watched him approach the window, the lights creating a halo around his head as if illuminating his path to whatever was pulling him toward that darkness outside. Suddenly, he leaned closer to the glass, peering out as if he were staring into another realm, and I felt a shiver crawl up my spine. Just then, the lights flickered, casting the room into a brief panic of shadows, and I swear I saw something flash across his face, fear, excitement, then despair all at once. He backed away as if he had seen something that struck dread, his breath quickening, and I couldn't help but think maybe I had crossed a line by speaking up. The restaurant's hum resumed, the waitstaff doing their best to maintain a charade of normalcy, but I couldn't shake that pulsing feeling growing in my gut, eerie and foreboding, as if some ancient curse had awoken from a long slumber. Everything was wrong now, from the decor to the polished silverware. The laughter felt hollow, as though a specter had begun to swirl amongst us, lingering on the edge of our consciousness. When he gradually approached his table again, now visibly on edge, something inside me braced for impact. Would he explode? Would he retaliate against my outburst? Instead, in a soft yet firm voice, he muttered something to his friends, and one of them laughed, unaware of how close to breaking he really was. With each second, I felt the weight of dread crawl closer as his laughter turned into an awkward silence, punctuated only by the creaking of wood beneath chairs and the clinking of glasses. In that moment, I was consumed by an overwhelming sense of guilt, a gut-wrenching realization. I had triggered this young man's descent into madness with a simple command to sit down, and as the clock ticked, I felt myself pulled deeper into a spiral of dread and regret, trapped in a moment that spiraled out of control until finally the shadows closed in on us all, and I wondered if I had just unleashed something dark, if perhaps it was I, the one ironically sitting down, who had finally surrendered to the sinister undercurrents of the world, forever marked by the terror of simply trying to enforce a semblance of civility. When I first met Aaron, his odd habit of sitting on the stairs struck me as endearing, a quirk that added charm to his otherwise grounded personality, but after 3 years of marriage, what I initially found whimsical became a chilling source of contention. Every evening like clockwork, perched against the staircase railing, he would sit staring into the shadows cast by the dim hallway light as if waiting for something, or someone. At first, I shrugged it off as a simple idiosyncrasy. We all have our routines, right? Yet, the deeper I delved into his unyielding descent into this strange fixation, the more I realized I was slipping down the rabbit hole with him. Friends raised eyebrows during dinner parties when Aaron spontaneously excused himself for stare time, and I found myself defending him when they laughed and made comments like, "Is he trying to catch ghosts?" My own laughter had faltered awkwardly, but dismissing the behavior outright felt wrong. In my heart, I could feel something lurking in the back of my mind, that unsettling chill that crawled down my spine, whispering that something wasn't right. It wasn't until the night of the storm that I first started questioning his fixation as more than just harmless silliness. The lightning struck so close that the glass in our windows rattled, and the power flickered, plunging us into darkness. I stumbled to find my flashlight, but as I neared the staircase, a strange sound drifted from Aaron's post, a low, hypnotic hum, flowing like water over stones. My heart raced as I shone the beam toward him, but he appeared blissfully ignorant of my presence, completely entranced. Just then, the hum morphed into words, taunting me, whispering my name with an unsettling familiarity that sent ice through my veins. I wanted to reach for him, to shake him out of whatever trance he was in, but my feet felt glued to the floor, unwilling to break the spell. "Aaron?" I finally squeaked. He blinked, his gaze coming into focus, and the look of pure confusion on his face was like a shard of glass slicing through my chest. "What's wrong?" he asked, voice thick with sleep. After stumbling over my words, I told him about the humming, but he shrugged it off as a trick of the storm. The next day, I decided to do some digging, researching stairs sitting online, and my stomach fell. It was a bizarre phenomenon some called positional meditation, with connections to cult-like practices, which began painting a sinister picture in my mind. I thought of confronting him but was paralyzed by fear. What if the quiet surrender to the shadows was a sign of something darker, a part of him I didn't know? Days turned into weeks, and the frequency of his stairs sitting escalated. Sometimes I could hear him murmuring, having conversations in a language I didn't recognize, while I became a ghost in our own home, hovering in the kitchens and bedrooms filled with toxic dread. One evening, desperation got the best of me, and I staked out in the hallway to confront him. I leaned against the wall, heart pounding, when I finally summoned the courage and confronted him, demanding he quit the odd ritual. But when I reached out, suddenly my world disintegrated as the air crackled around us. "You don't understand," he pleaded, his eyes wide with something I had never seen before, fear mixed with exhilaration. "They are waiting for me. The sound calls." I felt ice twisting in my stomach. There it was, the singular rift between us, with me standing firmly on one side, desperately trying to pull him back from whatever abyss he tumbled into. Panic washed over me, and I insisted we needed help, but Aaron only tightened his grip on the banister, eyes glistening as though he were torn, an entire universe breaking apart behind them. That was when the strange noises began. Every night after he started spiraling, the walls creaked and groaned, shadows flickered just out of view, like they were sneering at our fragile existence. I debated whether I should call someone or wake him, but then I hesitated and drowned in silence. I spent sleepless nights on the couch, terrified to wander near the stairs lest I catch a glimpse of whatever ethereal thing had captivated him. Then one night, just when I thought I could accept our new distorted reality, I awoke to find Aaron standing at the foot of the stairs, staring up into the blackness, taking on an almost ghostly posture, unblinkingly fixated on the top step, where a pale, flickering light began to materialize. My voice croaked as I called out, demanding to know what he could see, but he merely responded, "They're here now, they've come for me." Time shattered, I felt my heart racing and an overwhelming urge to flee. The very shadows that had once draped our home now felt like living entities, swirling and beckoning. In a moment of extreme desperation and instinct, I lunged and grabbed him, pulling him away from the bottom step, terrified of the fate he was so eagerly embracing. The light winked out with a pop, and he turned to me, rage and confusion flaring in his eyes before something in them dimmed, and he finally seemed to break free from whatever enchantment had gripped him. "What did you do?" he murmured, a hint of panic creeping into his voice. I took a step back, horrified yet relieved, realizing I had yanked him back from some tongue-in-cheek path that offered nothing but despair. We spent that night talking. I tried explaining the sounds, the way he'd been acting, the horror clawing through my mind. He listened, nodding slowly, but it felt like trying to stitch a gaping wound closed with nothing but threads of silence. He promised to stop sitting on the stairs, but the truth was, he didn't. He just did it when I wasn't home, and what was even worse? It didn't seem to bother him, a secret pathway he had invisibly carved for himself. The creaking of the stairs became my worst nightmare, a haunting reminder that something darker was tangled in the very fabric of our lives, gnawing at the edges of our reality. A few weeks later, I received a message from a friend who had seen a post on a local forum. It was about stair sitting, but this time the tone shifted towards something darker. Someone related their own experience, detailing people who had disappeared after embracing the dark ritual surrounding stair sitting. My heart crumpled as I understood too well that each tale resonated painfully with our own. I couldn't bear to think that Aaron was edging toward that fate, and that's when I realized it was no longer a simple quirk, it was a siren call to his very essence. One night, I confronted him yet again, my voice trembling as I pleaded for him to talk to me, to let me help him break free from this malevolent pull. He grew distant, his eyes glazing over as he muttered about how the connection was irreplaceable, his lips curling into a smile that made my skin crawl. In the pit of my stomach, I felt doom approaching. The shadows were gathering once again, a thick black fog creeping closer, and I didn't know if I could save him before it was too late. Things escalated into madness. Every time I caught him sitting, whispers would crawl through the house like a sinister echo, and I grew more frantic. I searched for solutions, scoured the web for anything that might help. Most advice seemed like a vague, foggy guide that only intensified the fear of my helplessness, but I stumbled upon a last resort suggestion, a ritual to confront what he now called the calling. I knew it could just as easily backfire, but if it meant saving him, I had to try. The night of the ritual came, and our home pulsed with an ominous energy as I set everything up, the air thick as I placed candles around us, trembling as I prepared to expose the heart of the problem once and for all. I asked him to sit on the stairs, to summon whatever dark force had wrapped itself around him, and for a moment, it appeared as if he was being pulled back into that strange trance as I followed behind, holding tightly to the love I had for him like a shield. When he closed his eyes and the shadows swirled, I could hear the faint sound of whispering, drawing us both in, and my mind was racing as I fought against the tangible hold they had on him. I felt like I was losing him all over again, but I pushed through. I cried out, begging for him to focus on me. Don't you see? They want you, but you're more than this. The energy shifted, rippling through the air, and I prayed for clarity, for him to break free from whatever malevolent grip was pulling him. For an agonizing moment, it looked as if he might not return, that the shadows would swallow him whole, but in a rush of courage, I wrapped my arms around his waist. It was a surge of feral determination that pulled him back to me, and he jolted awake, gasping as the dark whispers faded into silence. We fell back onto the floor, panting heavily. I won't let you go, I cried, holding him tightly, as though I could sew his very essence back together. I thought we would be safe now, that the dark merely needed to be confronted, but a sudden realization crashed over me like thunder. Aaron's grin had shifted from a mere twisted amusement to something far more sinister. He whispered into my ear, "They're still here." The air turned cold, and even as I felt hope bloom in my chest, the shadows flickered back to life, thickening around us, absorbing my disbelief as they reached for my husband, my love, threatening to unravel every shred of light I still harbored. Now as I sit here, heart racing and hands trembling, I can't help but wonder if in my desperate attempts to save him, in defending against that haunting ritual, I've only placed myself within reach of the darkness too. AITA for defending my husband's stair-sitting habits? I think I already know the answer, and I'm terrified of what it may mean for the both of us. I never thought a simple issue like punctuality could unravel my life in such a terrifying way, but here I am, staring blankly at my phone, the glint of the screen reflecting my dread as I anticipate their all-too-familiar late arrival. My in-laws, the Johnsons, have turned tardiness into an art form. You see, it's not just the usual 15 minutes late, but often an hour, 2 hours, or sometimes not at all. Yes, they've pulled that stunt too, leaving me waiting in the restaurant, awkwardly pretending to enjoy a glass of wine while I wonder if they've been kidnapped by aliens or simply decided they'd rather binge-watch Friends than honor my dinner invitation. It's been years of this, and I've reached my breaking point. After yet another instance of me pacing the restaurant like a caged animal, I snapped and texted them a harsh message before this latest dinner with my wife's family: if you can't make it on time, don't come at all. When they finally arrived, nearly an hour late, my father-in-law's face twisted in confusion, while my mother-in-law tutted softly, like a schoolteacher reprimanding a particularly dull student, but I didn't back down when they stormed out, leaving the restaurant empty and echoing our abandoned table. The rest of the evening was a tense silence at home, the air thick with my wife's disappointment, which turned to anger after she received a text from her mother, suggesting her husband was a monster who couldn't handle a few minor inconveniences. That night, I lay in bed listening to the muffled sounds of my wife on her phone, her whispered arguments and the occasional near sob causing shadows to loom taller in our bedroom, until, at last, she turned toward me and refused to speak, her back a cold wall of resentment. Days went by after this explosive dinner, leaving me isolated and uncertain, with strings of tension that felt heavier than the very air I breathed, filling our home with an oppressive silence that buzzed around me. I started noticing things. Maybe my nerves were getting to me, but every time I walked past my in-laws' house, the curtains would twitch just a little too much, and I could swear I saw shadows that felt out of place, as if someone was always watching, waiting for a moment to pounce. My phone lit up late one night, a photo from my mother-in-law. The image showed my unseen daughter, barely 3 years old, standing at the window with that innocent, quizzical gaze, while the backyard glowed with an unsettling, almost unnatural light. I felt my insides twist when I noticed the reflection in the window behind her. It was my mother-in-law, but there was something wrong in her eyes, something wild, a glint that sent ice running through my veins, though I brushed it off as paranoia, convinced I was simply spiraling due to the stress of family tensions. But things only escalated. I began finding notes on my car, slipped under the windshield wipers that only read, "Time is slipping away," with no signature. Just a trembling anxiety creeping further into my soul. I told my wife about it, although I regretted the moment I saw the doubt construct a fortress around her disbelief, and she suggested I was overstressed, living in a fog of paranoia, but I knew better. Something was horribly wrong, and it seemed to mirror the late arrivals of my in-laws. One rainy evening as I returned from work, I noticed them standing in their driveway, drenched, appearing almost ghostly in the dim light, and when they finally approached, they had that same eerie look. They claimed to have just arrived back from a trip, yet this wasn't a regular visit. My skin prickled with dread as I processed that the clothes they wore didn't match weather conditions, nor did they carry any luggage. They insisted on spending time with my daughter, and despite my instincts screaming at me to protect her, my wife played along, and I could only hang back, unease coiling like a serpent in my gut as they led her into the dark house, a cavernous maw waiting to swallow innocent laughter. Things went completely dark when my daughter didn't return for hours, and I rushed around, pacing, calling her name before I banged down my in-laws' door, only to find them sitting there, hazy, eyes shimmering as they told me they were just having fun. Yet my little girl's absence felt like an eternity, and each second stretched into endless possibilities, a knot twisted unyieldingly at my core. Panic welled inside me, erupting into visceral desperation as I tore through their house, the fading scent of something metallic pulling me further into the nightmare unfolding within each stagnant room as I began seeing bizarre photographs plastered on the walls, pictures of children playing but with disturbing overtones of something nefarious, like their laughter was forcibly infused into each snapshot, faces twisted into grotesque smiles that made my skin crawl. I finally found my daughter, sitting eerily still in a dim-lit kitchen, her eyes glazed over, staring blankly into space, as if something had siphoned the brightness from her soul. When I reached for her, a voice, low and viscous, crawled through the air, laced with ethereal confidence that suggested they had been waiting for me all along. "You have to let her stay, she's ours now." With a primal scream, I ripped my daughter from the table, sprinting out of the house while a collective whisper cascaded behind me, sharpness in the air, promising I had only buried the truth of their generational curse deeper beneath a facade of civility. I bolted down the street, holding my child tightly as the relentless echoes of their laughter melded into a cacophony of threat behind me. Now, every time I hear the doorbell ring or see their silhouettes hovering in the corner of my eye, I am reminded that I can't escape the haunting truth. It's all interconnected, the waiting, the late arrivals, the suffocating silence betraying a sinister undercurrent that knows our fears and plays with them like a puppet master, realizing now that my choice to demand punctuality had awakened something within them that shouldn't have been stirred, and perhaps I sealed our fate when I thought I was just standing my ground. I never thought I'd be the type to make a mountain out of a molehill, but when I found myself standing in the doorframe of my boyfriend's apartment, my breath caught in my throat at the sight of his bed, cluttered and filthy, as though a tornado had swooped through and decided to make it the epicenter of chaos. Clothes were strewn everywhere, mostly crumpled t-shirts and socks that I was sure had grown sentient from the level of stagnation and odors wafting through the air, and the sheets looked like they hadn't been changed in weeks. The stark contrast between the me who loved clean spaces and the him who seemed to revel in squalor became almost unbearable. I tried to mask my discomfort with a laugh, joking about how he was practically living in a pigsty, but deep down, the thought of laying in that unkempt space made my skin crawl. He just smiled back, oblivious, as he plopped onto the mattress, inviting me to join him. I hesitated, my mind racing with visions of all the microscopic horrors that could be lurking within that unclean sanctuary. "Are you serious?" I finally said, my voice rising slightly in disbelief. "I can't sleep in that thing." He frowned, and for a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of something in his eyes, anger, perhaps? Disappointment. I couldn't pin it down, but the mood shifted like the flicker of a candle just before it extinguishes. I backed away, shaking my head. "You need to clean up. I'm not going to sleep on whatever that is." He stood up, the disappointment morphing into something darker, like the thunderclouds gathering on the horizon. "Well, if you can't handle it," he spat, "maybe you don't deserve to be here at all." It felt like a slap to the face, and for a moment, hurt washed over me, replaced quickly by anger. "It's not about deserving, it's about hygiene. I thought you cared about your living space." But he glared at me as though I had just insulted a sacred relic, and I felt the tension coil into something like a visible entity between us. I was taken aback by the ferocity of his reaction, not having realized then just how deep the roots of his attachment to that mess went. He stormed past me, slamming a door I didn't even see behind him, and I took a shaky breath, stepping back out into the hall, needing to escape the oppressive atmosphere. I hesitated, wondering if I was being unreasonable, but I couldn't shake off a nagging feeling that something wasn't right. I left his apartment and drove home, feeling the betrayal of the moment like a heavy fog suffocating my thoughts. Days passed without a word between us, and the silence was deafening. I kept replaying our argument in my head, trying to convince myself that I was justified in refusing to sleep in what felt like a den of filth, but my conscience was riddled with guilt. Just when I thought the tension would become unbearable, he reached out to me, sending a simple "I miss you." My heart flipped, and I immediately replied, arranging a dinner where we could sort everything out. But as I pulled into the parking lot, an unsettling chill crept down my spine, as though I were stepping into the lion's den armed only with my feeble attempts at diplomacy. I could see him waiting by the entrance, but this time, the usual warmth was replaced with a tension that twisted at my gut. "Let's talk in my apartment," he suggested, his voice eerily casual, too casual for how I felt. As we entered, I held my breath, bracing for the chaos of his lair, only to find it surprisingly clean. The bed was made, and the floor was swept. It felt almost alien in its transformation, but I was still cautious. "What happened?" I managed, crossing my arms defensively. "I cleaned up," he replied, wearing a smug grin. But the jovial tone in his voice fell flat as I noticed the strange glint in his eyes, something sinister lurking behind that practiced smile. I glanced around, uneasy, and sat on the edge of the couch rather than risking proximity to that once abominable bed. Over dinner, which he insisted on preparing himself, my unease only grew. The clattering of forks felt haunting, and as he spoke, I caught him watching me with an intensity that made my skin prickle. I asked him about his sudden change in attitude, but the conversation felt forced, flitting over other topics and distractions. By the time we finished eating, I was ready to leave, but he broached a topic that sent chills straight to my core. "So, about my bed," he said, leaning closer, his eyes holding mine in an unwavering grip. "You know I've always wanted to share that space with you. It means a lot to me." I felt a knot of dread seize my stomach. "You want me to sleep in that bed?" I shook my head, caution flaring in me. "You have to understand, I can't. I can't just forget what it was like. That's not just about cleanliness, it feels." I hesitated, looking for the right word. It felt unsafe. The smile vanished from his lips, replaced by something cold and deadly, and suddenly I could see that glint in his eyes morph into a shadow that seemed to envelop both of us. "Do you not trust me?" His voice dropped to a hoarse whisper, a threat sliding between the words, and I stumbled back, feeling a claustrophobic weight surround me. I started, trying to express the tangled mess of my thoughts, but the air became thick with an unsettling silence until he stood in front of me. "You never even tried to understand," he said quietly, his voice almost soothing as fear clawed at my insides. He took a step closer, and instinctively I stepped back. "Did you ever think that maybe the mess was a part of me?" I shook my head vigorously, trying to form a coherent response, but the walls felt like they were closing in, the space suddenly becoming intimate in the worst possible way. I shouted, desperation clawing through my voice as he moved to block the exit, his expression shifting between puzzlement and anger. "I tried to understand, but there's a limit. I can't just ignore the feeling." "Feeling?" he echoed, voice dripping with mockery. "Why is it that you get to dictate what I am allowed to feel?" At this point, I knew I was in true danger. He was unraveling in front of me, the shape of the man I knew becoming something unfamiliar, grotesque. The fear urged me to scream, but I held it back, not wanting to escalate the situation. I pivoted, darting towards the kitchen and grabbing my phone, my only tether to the outside world. In one swift motion, I dialed for help, praying the police would pick up, but the second he realized what I was doing, I felt his hot breath against my neck. "You think you can get away that easily? You think calling someone is going to save you now?" I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, pounding like a war drum accompanied by visions of the boy I once loved morphing into something menacing. "You don't want to do this," I managed, my voice shaky. "I'm leaving." "You're not going anywhere," he hissed, and at that moment, the facade shattered completely, the man I had once cared for replaced by a creature I barely recognized. I dropped the phone, stumbling backward, heart racing as I searched for an escape route. "I thought we could share everything." His voice rang hollow, eyes dark, almost cavernous. I dashed towards the back door just as he lunged at me, his fingertips brushing the skin of my arm which felt like ice against my skin. I tore away from him, throwing open the door, sprinting into the night. My lungs burned as I ran, hearing him scream behind me, a sound so primal and furious that it sent adrenaline coursing through my veins, drowning out the audio of my panicked breaths. I didn't stop until I reached my car, nearly collapsing as I scrambled into the driver's seat, slamming the door behind me like it could shield me from the chaos. My phone buzzed frantically in my pocket as I dialed the police for the second time, my voice trembling as I explained what had happened, the dispatcher's calm voice a lifeline in the storm. I kept glancing back at the apartment, haunted by the fear of him emerging once again, wishing I had never walked into that filthy sanctuary of his, wishing I had never dismissed my instincts. I was shaken to my core, and though I never thought I'd become someone who would rely on outward appearances to judge character, those first moments of discomfort rang alarmingly clear in my memory. A few officers arrived within minutes, breaking down the door only for it to reveal an untouched space. They found nothing, no sign of violence, no clues, but when they turned to me, concern etched on their faces, I realized that the thing that had terrified me most wasn't the dirt or the mess. It was what had been buried underneath, something festering and idle, a reflection of a darkness that came from the very mind of the man I once loved. And as the adrenaline faded and reality settled back in, I couldn't shake the chilling thought that I had narrowly escaped a fate that could have been so much worse, all because I had refused to share a dirty bed. Last month, I found myself caught in a whirlwind of chaos that turned my quiet suburban life upside down, all because of my near-adult son's gluten intolerance, which frankly seemed to surface just as he was nearing 18, insisting on gluten-free meals while treating me like the villain for refusing to cater to his whims. It all started innocently enough when I was rummaging through a dusty box of old family recipe cards, hoping to rediscover the love I once had for cooking, but the sound of my son's voice interrupted my daydreams of homemade pasta, the way he breathlessly announced his new dietary demands as if he had just won the lottery, and my heart sank, thinking of the ravaged gluten-filled meals we shared, the memories now tainted by his self-imposed culinary prison. I told him that cooking had always been a joy for me, but now it felt like I was being shackled with chains with every new gluten-free request, and yet there was something deeper I noticed in his eyes. A kind of desperation that struck me as odd, as if this was less about the food and more about something he wasn't telling me. But when I asked him why all of a sudden gluten was the enemy, he merely shrugged, muttering roughly about feeling better since spring started, and looking for a sense of control in a world that was rapidly falling apart around him. Still, no matter how many times I attempted to reason with him, he insisted on staying gluten-free, refusing any family meals I prepared unless they fit his strict parameters, which left me feeling like I was losing my grip on him. What's worse, he had a penchant for dragging me into his world of restrictive eating, and soon I was spending sleepless nights scrolling gluten-free recipes that felt more like torture than genuine interest. The thought of denying him any kind of dinner out together gnawed at my conscience, yet I was firm in my belief that he was simply going through a phase, the phase of teenage rebellion taken too far. And when he turned the heat up, I finally knew I had to put my foot down, refusing to take him out for meals, holding on to the hope that someday he'd break free of this ridiculous gluten-free fad and return to the son I once knew. My refusal only escalated tensions in our home, with every shared meal now threatening to collapse into an argument, and that's when things began to shift. I noticed something strange about the food I had started preparing. Dishes that had once been a source of comfort now felt tainted, an ominous shadow creeping into my kitchen. The taste of my chicken soup became metallic. Nothing matched up with memories of laughter and family gatherings around the table, as I shivered with the knowledge that something darker lurked within my own walls. Then, one evening while cleaning the basement, I stumbled upon an old recipe hidden beneath a pile of dust, scrawled in my late grandmother's handwriting, speaking of a healing herb, warning of its powers and how it could twist the body in response to the words sent out, and I couldn't help but feel a creeping dread that the reason for my son's sudden gluten intolerance wasn't a passing fad but something rooted in generations of our family, lingering remnants of old-world knowledge entwined with strange and twisted practices that we inherited without question, as if the very act of cooking was a ritual now twisted in ways we never understood. Inevitable outcomes loomed closer with each meal I prepared, twisting the knife further, the moment I faced him again over dinner after unearthing it, trying to mask my concern behind a veneer of normalcy. I watched as he devoured the food, his face twisting with each bite, making me question my own choices. The walls around us seemed to breathe as I asked if he liked the meal, praying for a different answer, when suddenly, everything fell silent. The fork slipped from his fingers, crashing against the plate as he doubled over. The horror on his face resonated with heartbreak. And I finally realized how the tables had turned. This wasn't just a diet where he could choose what to eat. It was metaphorically chaining his essence, his very being, transforming him into something I could barely recognize. Was it the food, the recipes, or something else entirely that sparked feelings of dread, fat panic rising in my throat as he gasped, pleading with red-rimmed eyes for some semblance of gluten just to make it stop. Each breath he gasped fully paralyzing me into place as fear coursed through me and, in one moment of despair, I understood. I no longer had the power to create meals that nurtured and healed, but ones that hurt and betrayed. The panic only heightened when I realized time was running out, and my only option was to regain some semblance of control, but that control had slipped through my fingers, out of reach, like grains of gluten he no longer seemed able to stomach. I raced back to the basement, frantically flipping through those weathered recipe cards in search for the herb, hoping against hope that maybe I could salvage something from this mess before it consumed us both, when all the while, I couldn't shake the horrifying thought that I might just be the monster feeding the curse, forced to come to terms with a truth I wasn't prepared to face, that the answer to our demise might have been hidden down in dark corners far deeper than either of us could have ever imagined. Ever since my parents divorced, family gatherings had started morphing into tense affairs, but nothing could have prepared me for the fallout when my dad's ex, Marla, showed up unexpectedly one rainy evening, drenched and disheveled, claiming she'd been evicted. As the thunder rumbled outside, I could feel the weight of her presence in our living room, a far cry from the woman I remembered, her usual vibrant laugh now reduced to a shaky whisper as she recounted her misfortunes to my dad, leaning heavily on the coffee table as if it was the only thing keeping her upright. I hung back in the hallway, my heart pounding. My instincts screamed that her flimsy excuses masked something darker, but my dad's sympathetic nods only fueled my unease. I knew how her charm could woo even the most skeptical, and as they discussed her dire situation, I felt something in the pit of my stomach twist. I'd heard the stories of her reckless behavior, her penchant for manipulation, and how she had once left my dad stranded in a sleazy motel with nothing but a change of clothes. My dad was generous to a fault, the kind of man who would give his last dime to someone in need, and while I admired his compassion, I worried he would fall prey to her act once again. I finally decided I couldn't remain a spectator. I stepped into the living room, my palms sweaty and my heart racing as I interrupted their conversation, my voice steadier than I felt. "Dad, we can't let her stay here." The room fell silent. Marla's eyes narrowed, simmering with an anger I had never seen directed toward me before. She quickly masked it with a feigned pout, and my dad's face twisted with confusion. "What do you mean?" "She needs help." I pressed on, my resolve hardening as I recounted her past, how she dragged him through the mud time and time again. "She's not just going to use us as a safety net to escape her own choices." Instead of the agreement I had anticipated, my dad waved my words away, his disappointment cutting deeper than my rejection of Marla seemed to sting her. In a dramatic turn, she dropped her head, feigning tears, and I saw the game in the way her lower lip trembled. "Are you really going to let her down?" My conscience screamed as she pointedly glanced at the spare room door. I fought back the urge to argue as the storm outside intensified, matching the tortured silence in the house. It felt as if lightning would split open the very roof above us. "I just need a week. Just until I get back on my feet," she pleaded, but I knew from experience that 1 week could turn into 1 month and then 1 year. The atmosphere thickened with tension. I could feel my dad wavering, torn between compassion and the realization that I was right, and it made my heart ache. "I'm sorry, but I still think she should leave," I said quietly, desperate to end this stalemate. Marla pressed her lips together, rage igniting behind her eyes as if I had personally insulted her. My dad's expression turned unreadable, a mixture of disappointment and frustration swirling like the storm outside. The minute tension bubbled over when she stood up suddenly, rage burning like cold fire in her eyes as she spat out, "You're going to regret this, kid." I took a step back, the hairs on my neck standing on end, and as she stormed out of the room, I felt an unsettling chill creep in, an inclination that I had just summarized a series of escalating consequences. Later that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that Marla would not simply let this go. The rain pattered on the roof gently, an eerie lullaby, but her parting words echoed violently through my mind. I tried to convince myself I had done the right thing, but deep down, a whisper niggled at me. Was I wrong to protect my space? The dread followed me into sleep, laced in vivid nightmares of lightning flashes illuminating her figure lurking outside, watching, waiting, as if planning her next move. Days turned into weeks, and the unease settled around our house like an unwelcome fog. The rain had stopped, but every time I stepped outside, the air had that charged quality, a sense of impending doom clinging to me. My fears were validated when strange things began to happen. First, it was the missing items, my favorite jacket, a set of headphones, even my car keys disappeared from plain sight. I dismissed it as misplacing them until I found a single deliberate note tucked beneath my pillow, written in a chaotic scrawl that sent shivers down my spine: "Freedom isn't free." Panic began swelling in me as every day someone knocked on our door, or my phone buzzed with an unknown number only to drop to silence as I answered, the static echoing heavily in the air. My dad tried brushing off my concerns, attributing everything to paranoia, his belief in second chances overshadowing my growing dread. I could feel him slipping further from me, and Marla was utilizing that as her tool. It wasn't until one evening, out of nowhere, I found my dad pacing the living room, his expression lost and strained as he cradled the numerous eviction notices piling up on the table. When I strayed closer, glancing at the papers and unable to comprehend why they would impact us, he looked at me helplessly. "She said she would help us." The final thread stretched to a breaking point. I felt the world around me collapse as gravity lost its grip. It wasn't Marla invading our home that terrified me, it was this silent truth that had woven its way into our lives like poison. I raced to my phone, dialing my dad's number with shaking hands, my own heart racing with desperation. I could hear my heart thudding against the walls of my chest like a war drum, and just then, my heart sank when I saw the screen light up minutes later with a familiar unknown number. I hesitated, every gut instinct screaming at me not to answer, but curiosity won. As I lifted the phone to my ear, that same chaotic laughter echoed through the receiver, cruel and mocking. "Didn't I tell you you'd regret it, kid?" It dawned on me, horrifyingly, just how much I had underestimated her. The line crackled with her malevolent glee, and a chill coursed through me like ice, yet I found my voice. "What do you want?" She responded slowly, each word dripped in venom. "You owe me for all I did for your father. I'll be a part of your life whether you like it or not." I nearly dropped the phone, mouth dry as panic surged, 1,000 terrible possibilities racing through my mind. That night I barricaded my bedroom door, adrenaline pumping as paranoia took hold. Each creak of the house felt sinister, it lingered like a sentient creature, watching for a moment of vulnerability. I knew she was out there, somewhere in the haze, waiting for the perfect moment to make her next move, and with that, I had everything I had wanted to regain balance slip through my fingers. When my in-laws announced their planned visit, I had mixed feelings. Their last visit had left me exhausted, and their habit of criticizing my parenting and my home loomed large in my mind, so I decided to child-proof our house even more than usual. It felt necessary, not just for my peace but also for the safety of my 3-year-old daughter, Ava, who could turn any mundane object into a weapon of chaos. I began with the basics: outlet covers, strapping the heavy bookshelf to the wall, and locking away any potentially harmful items. But as I rummaged through the cabinets for anything that might hand my in-laws an excuse to criticize, I stumbled upon an old shoebox filled with knickknacks from my childhood. Inside, I found an ornate porcelain figurine that my mother had insisted on keeping in the living room, a delicate ballet dancer with a lifted dress and pointed toes, fragile yet hauntingly beautiful. A chill ran down my spine at the thought of Ava breaking at the moment Grandma laid eyes on it. So, I tucked it away in the attic, convinced it was the responsible thing to do. In the weeks that followed, I became hyper-aware of my surroundings. Every corner, every shelf was scrutinized. I installed more baby gates than I could count and even placed breathable netting over our balcony railing. It was excessive, but I wanted to avoid the shame of an "I told you so" from my in-laws, should the worst happen. The night before their arrival, I barely slept. My mind raced, plagued by visions of what might go wrong: a splinter, a bruise, or worse, an injury. When the morning came, I was a bundle of nerves, jumping at every sound. As I sat in anxious silence with Ava, the doorbell rang. The moment my in-laws stepped inside, my stomach twisted. I could see my father-in-law's judgmental gaze scanning our living room, taking in the extra safety measures, dissecting them with quiet disdain. But a part of me felt triumphant because I felt like I'd done my part to protect my daughter. They greeted Ava with a syrupy sweetness that made me even more uneasy. As the day progressed, my in-laws prattled on about their lives in the city, how much better things were there, and I bit my tongue to hold back a million retorts about the pressures of city living. Their comments turned to parenting advice before long, filled with passive-aggressive suggestions that sent my blood pressure soaring. I steered them away from danger zones. The balcony is off-limits, because of the netting. But they insisted that Ava could handle it. And then I heard it, a soft, yet unmistakable sound from above. The attic. I felt a sense of dread wash over me. Could my daughter have found a way up? I excused myself, my heart racing, and bounded upstairs 2 steps at a time, convinced I'd find her playing among the cobwebs. The attic door creaked open, and I stepped into the dim light, expecting to find calamity awaiting. Instead, I was met only with silence. My eyes scanned the room, landing on the old shoebox, a single beam of light catching on the porcelain dancer. But when I approached, my hand brushed against a pile of items hidden beneath a dust-covered blanket, and I froze. It was personal stuff, my old toys, and also something that wasn't mine, a rusted knife, half buried beside an old doll. I recoiled, backing away, but the moment did send chills through me. Why on earth was a knife up here? Just as I took a breath to regain my composure, a loud crash echoed downstairs. I bolted down the stairs, the whisper of dread trailing behind me. Upon entering the living room, I nearly fainted. Ava sat on the floor amidst the ruins of a table lamp, her wide eyes reflecting a mixture of surprise and pure delight. My in-laws were glaring at her, my mother-in-law shielding her mouth in horror as my father-in-law reached for the phone to call someone. I panicked. "It's just a lamp," I practically screamed, gripping Ava as she chimed in cheerfully, obliviously proud of her little escapade. "Look, Mommy, I knocked it over." But my mother-in-law wasn't done. She launched into a tirade about how I needed to control my child, the implications of an uncluttered house cutting deeper than the knife I'd found. I felt my heart racing in my chest, rage bubbling over as I snapped back. "I'm just trying to keep her safe." "Is that a crime?" The air thickened with tension, words spilling out like toxic waste. Ava whimpered as the shouting echoed around her, turning her giggles into tears. My memory of the rusted knife clawed at me, whispering the dangers lurking in the corners of parental responsibility. The in-laws left that day under a cloud of disappointment that carried through the air like a death knell. After they left, I turned to Ava, feeling more defeated than ever. It was just a table lamp, but I could sense too much had been awakened. That night, I found myself back in the attic, drawn to the violated innocence of my childhood treasures. I didn't care that I was scaring myself. I needed to understand why someone would have hidden that knife. As I pulled the doll from the pile, I was unprepared for the sight of something I'd never noticed before, stitched into the fabric, a single word in fading thread: "Help." The letters blurred together until a memory from so long ago slapped me in the face. It was my mother's warning, a phrase I hadn't thought about since childhood, a nondescript caution about strangers, but I had dismissed it then, just as I had dismissed the weird unease my in-laws always stirred within me. Parental instincts, they say, are born through fear, but I realized my fear ran deeper this time. The knife, the warnings, the porcelain dancer, it all fit into a secret puzzle of silence that I thought had been long forgotten. Suddenly, the mundane act of child-proofing my house felt like a wake-up call to a monstrous reality. I climbed back down, determined but unnerved. Nothing else mattered now. I had to protect Ava. The old fears returned in waves, whispering the awful truth that sometimes, the real dangers come not from our children, but from the shadows we inadvertently bring into our lives. And as I stood guard at Ava's bedroom door that night, listening to her soft breathing, I felt the eerie sensation of being watched, as if the shadows were deliberating, waiting for an opportunity to rise. The next time my in-laws planned a visit, I'd have to make a choice. Would I child-proof against the world, or would I prepare for the secrets that hid behind the look of disappointment on their faces? Growing up, I always knew I was different from the other kids in my town. While most families seemed whole and uncomplicated, my reality was a patchwork quilt of half-truths and familial tensions, my parents' marriage a fragile thing that shattered when I was just 15. It was then that my mom revealed to me the existence of my half-sister, Lily, a product of my dad's affair, and though I initially felt a strange sort of sympathy for her, that empathy twisted and hardened as years went by. With my mother constantly torn between her loyalty to our bloodline and the shame her husband's infidelity brought upon us, she began to favor Lily, at least in the subtler, unmeasured ways: an extra scoop of ice cream at parties, bonus minutes spent in delighted conversation that I never seemed to earn. It came to a head when my mother decided to gift Lily our family's most prized heirloom, a delicate silver necklace adorned with a single emerald, which had belonged to my grandmother and was said to carry the blessings of strength and resilience. That summer evening, as I stood there aghast, Lily grinning in delighted astonishment while my heart pounded like a war drum echoing betrayal through my veins, I felt my chest constrict with such a mix of emotions: rage, contempt, and something jaggedly sharp that I'd only admit to myself years later, a deep, gnawing sense of loss. I told her she didn't deserve it, the words spilling out of my mouth like venom, and for a moment the air was thick with a silence that amplified the quiet sobs my mother stifled. In an instant, Lily's joy was crushed under the weight of my accusation, her face paling. "You don't even know me," she retorted, but the words cut deeper than any knife, and for a fleeting moment, I saw irritation fuse with sadness in her eyes. Everything spiraled after that. My mom refused to talk to me, her disappointment a tangible cloud that enveloped our home, wrapping itself so tightly around me that I suffocated in shame. I convinced myself I was right, that I was standing up for the sanctity of our family line, not to mention my grandmother's memory, but every day that dragged into weeks left a bitter residue on my soul, and Lily was the ghost haunting me wherever I went until one nameless, starlit night I found myself on my way to meet her, a stupid impulse driving me forward like a moth to a flame, thinking maybe, just maybe, I could mend the frayed edges of the relationship I sabotaged so recklessly. Lily lived in an old Victorian that smelled of mildew and neglect, her laughter once light-hearted now tinged with a hardness that spoke of years spent being a shadow, always outshined by a bone-deep allure of a necklace she knew would never belong to her. She opened the door with hesitation, and I noticed the way her eyes flickered with a cocktail of surprise and cautious hope. "What do you want?" she asked, but the sharpness of her tone melted the moment she caught sight of the little box I held closely, the very one my mother had used to gift her that damned necklace. "I'm sorry," I stuttered, feeling the weight of my words evaporate in the cool night air. "I wanted you to have it, because it's not the necklace that matters, it's what it represents, the love and connection that comes with it." Yet as I held out the small box, Lily's expression shifted, confusion wrinkles furrowing her brow. "You're just saying that because of Mom," she whispered, bitterness flowing through every syllable, making me realize how wrong I was to believe that a simple apology would eclipse the years of resentment we shared. But then, she surprised me, her eyes softening as she slowly reached for the box, delicate fingers trembling, and I felt a warm swell in my chest. For a moment, we exchanged something sacred, a flicker of that sisterly bond that had been buried in the rubble of our complicated heritage. But in the back of my mind, a plaguing thought lingered: what if the real ghost that was haunting me wasn't the fractured family ties but rather what lay inside that necklace box? As the night unfolded, and shadows danced across her living room, something broke in me when I finally said, "It's cursed." Lily laughed, a sound that echoed against the walls, disbelief sparkling in her eyes, but I persisted, recounting the whispers I'd heard, the warnings passed down through years, that the necklace held a dark secret. My grandmother had insisted on wearing it every single day until her last breath, her slow decline a shadowed testimony to its malevolence. That revelation hung in the air like a lightning storm, and I hoped the curse would shatter the moment, expose any fragile connection we had. But when Lily pulled the necklace from its velvet resting place, I swear I felt the temperature drop as darkness unfurled around us, an unsettling whisper brushing through the air, weaving itself through the tension. "You think I can't handle it?" she challenged, heart blazing with defiance, and my stomach dropped as I caught her twisting the delicate chain around her neck, the emerald glimmering ominously at the hollow of her throat. The lights flickered, shadows growing long and distorted, stretching across the room, and I felt as if I was standing at the edge of a precipice as dread unfurled like a storm. I approached her cautiously, my heart racing, assuring her it was just an old wives' tale, but the moment she pressed her fingertips against the cool emerald, my voice was drowned out by a rumble, the ground beneath us trembling. Suddenly, with a crash, the windows shattered violently, a gust of icy wind rushing in, a fury unleashed. I screamed for her to take it off, but she stood there, frozen, eyes wide with a mix of terror and exhilaration, a new kind of laughter spilling from her lips that sent chills down my spine. In that instant, I knew we were no longer searching for forgiveness, nor sisterhood, but rather that darkness was claiming her, just as it had claimed our grandmother. The necklace now tangled around her like a malevolent snake, it began to glow with an ethereal light, and as the horrifying truth dawned on me, I realized I didn't just destroy our family's legacy, I unleashed a haunting that neither of us could escape. It was too late for apologies now. With a heartbreaking resolve, I rushed towards her, desperate to rip it away, but unearthly sounds erupted from the shadows, screeching and wailing, a cacophony promising suffering, promising that we had both become part of something far beyond our understanding. The necklace glowed brighter, swallowing her whole as Lily screamed, an echo of anger, fear, and, above all, despair, before she simply vanished, the necklace spiraling into darkness as my heart shattered. I stumbled back, gasping, the world around me disassembling into chaos as I realized the truth was never about deserving the necklace, it was about the curse that tethered us both to the ghosts of our past, and in my heart, I knew I would forever carry the weight of what happened that night, a sister still lost to the shadows, the necklace a constant reminder that in this twisted story, no one was truly innocent and I was left haunted by the question, AITA for telling my half-sister she didn't deserve my mom's necklace? When my cousin Morgan invited me to her graduation party, I was excited but also apprehensive. She had always been the golden child, and I never really measured up, so when I discovered through a mutual friend that she'd actually paid her way through an online diploma mill, a secret she vehemently tried to keep under wraps, I felt compelled to confront her in a way I never had before. As I arrived at the lavishly decorated backyard where Instagram-ready balloons floated like pastel clouds and a makeshift wooden stage awaited the valedictorian speech, I saw Morgan basking in the glow of attention, glamorous in her cap and gown, but something about her smile felt rehearsed, a facade that cracked when I caught her in a whispered conversation with her mother, her eyes betraying a flicker of vulnerability, a hint of the dread that shadowed her achievement. The tension spiraled as I witnessed her proudly accepting faux accolades from family members who knew nothing about the truth, their hearts too eager to embrace the lie she had spun, and despite my reservations, I found myself standing closer than I should have, caught in a tide of bitter resentment and the sinking realization that the very fabric of our familial love was woven by deception. When the moment arrived, and the spotlight danced its way to me, I felt a surge of jealousy threaten to overthrow my sanity as I grasped the microphone, and almost involuntarily, I blurted out, "Congratulations, Morgan. But I guess it's not my fault you bought your degree." The gasps were audible, a sharp intake of air that split the warm afternoon like thunder, and Morgan's expression shifted instantly from shock to rage, the kind that transformed her cherubic face into a monstrous reflection of pure betrayal. Struggling to maintain my composure under the onslaught of disdainful glares from shocked relatives, I felt a rush of adrenaline, knowing I had thrown a match into a sea of dry kindling. It was a chaotic flurry of shouting voices and clattering utensils, her mother gasping as if I had slapped her across the face. Morgan lunged at me, fists flying, but I didn't back down. My voice echoed like a battle cry as I shouted back about the years spent on her high horse while I worked hard for every scrap of recognition I ever got. The guests' faces were a grim collage of disappointment and concern as Morgan choked back tears and accused me of ruining her day, insisting that our family's blood and humor had always been worth celebrating, but I stood firm in my accusation, questioning the very essence of her achievement, a hyena's laugh punctuating the tension as I pointed to her stack of ceremony photos where every smile seemed to mock the truth, and in that moment, her mask slipped away entirely, revealing the dread underneath. The argument devolved into an exhibition of dirty laundry dragged through the sunshine, where her past transgressions and insecurities collided with my burdens, creating an intangible fissure between us that I feared could never be mended, all eyes piercing through me with an intensity I had never felt before, until suddenly, an older relative stepped in, an uncle I hadn't spoken to in years, who claimed to know everything, or at least our family folklore, and in that uncanny silence that followed his boisterous entry, I realized I wasn't alone in feeling weighed down by each lie we had ever entertained. It seemed there were whispers buried beneath the layers of our gatherings, and somehow I had exposed an unseen reality that shook the very roots of our idyllic narratives, and as the evening devolved into something grotesque, I felt the atmosphere shift as Morgan's confidence withered, beaten down by the harsh glare of scrutiny while our relatives circled her like vultures, waiting for her to admit her mistake amidst the chaos I had ignited. Days melted into nights, turning that party into a cursed memory, an echo reverberating in my mind where guilt twisted with vindication. I became the antagonist in my family's story, labeled as the villain who dared to expose the truth in the face of a flawless facade, while Morgan slipped deeper into denial, swaddled by the lies she had built her life upon until her phone began buzzing like a hornet's nest. Yet the only messages I received were warnings from friends out of fear of family repercussions for having spoken my mind. A week later, I awoke to a world shimmering with silence. The calls from my family had ceased, the chatter turned hollow, and every gathering near my doorstep became a reminder of the rift I had created, until Morgan's mother called me with that threatening tone, implying that I had pulled the curtain on a family scandal too sinister to ignore and told me that if I valued our relationship at all, I would confess and apologize, but I staunchly held my ground, knowing deep down our world was riddled with secrets worth preserving. But as tension morphed into shadows, something shifted in the air. Whispers followed me through the streets as eye contact became a dangerous commodity among family, where every encounter felt like a trial for my transgressions. And one particularly lonely night, as I sat on my porch nursing regrets, Morgan appeared without warning, her eyes clouded with uncertainty but her resolve sparked like wildfire. The once inseparable bond now lay ruptured, festering wounds of jealousy and betrayal threatening to drown any flicker of hope. She confessed that she had lived in fear, unable to tell anyone the truth about how she felt trapped in the mirage of success she had crafted, the facade becoming a noose as constricting as the expectations her mother thrust upon her. I watched her as she broke down, everything she personified crumbling into a cascade of tears. I thought this vulnerability might grant us the catharsis needed, but instead, the revelation left a bitter taste that thickened the already toxic atmosphere. In the weeks that followed, the atmosphere thickened with dread, but I could not shake the feeling that I had unleashed something dark and vast into our lives. But it wasn't until Morgan threatened to seek her truth among strangers and let the world see what lay beneath our collective skin, that I understood how fragile our positions were. Each word we exchanged now felt like blades sharp enough to cleave the very fabric of our belonging, and I wondered if I had become the architect of my own isolation, torn between the vindication of honesty and the warmth of denial that had wrapped us like a cocoon for too long. When the day finally dawned, bright yet oppressive, I found myself spiraling, the daylight harsh against my regret as Morgan prepared to reveal all on social media. My heart pounded like a war drum, my vision tunneled in on the inevitable pain, but when she finally pressed send, I was left gasping in shock as the floodgates opened. Those who had smiled at her celebration turned into virtual haters, cloaked in anonymity yet wielding their venom like knives as they punctured her facade, leaving Morgan in the ruins of her own making, shattered pieces drifting away as their words became anchors that dragged her deeper into despair. In the aftermath, as relatives distanced themselves and the truth morphed into its own gelatinous monster, I wondered whether I had been right all along or merely too cowardly to save us from the inevitable. And as Morgan sat in a self-constructed prison of hate and sorrow, I learned through the lens of my own brokenness that sometimes, saying the hard truth reveals scars too deep to heal, leaving behind a silence that echoes louder than any shout of victory could ever hope to drown. I never thought a high school election could be the catalyst for so much chaos, but when I found myself losing the race for class president to Alex, a guy who was as popular as a sparkling social media influencer and twice as fake, something inside me snapped. Leading up to the election, I had poured my heart into my campaign, pouring countless hours into speeches and posters, all while trying to promote my vision of a more inclusive school, only to watch as Alex waltzed around, throwing lavish parties and posting perfectly staged selfies that made me feel like a ghost compared to his booming presence. On that fateful day, as the countdown to the announcement ticked down, I felt an undercurrent of dread snaking through my thoughts, an awareness that my passion for change stood no chance against shallow charm. When the principal finally declared Alex the winner, the sound of raucous applause and laughter felt like a dagger plunging into my chest, leaving me breathless with anger and humiliation. In a fit of rage, I stormed out of the auditorium, unable to contain my gnawing frustration, not just at losing but at the entire system that glorified mediocrity over genuine effort. I was tired of pretending it didn't matter. It did matter. Fueled by indignation, I hastily drafted a resignation letter on my phone, angrily posting it in our class group chat, bitterly declaring that there was no way someone like Alex could lead us. I thought my message might resonate, maybe even go viral around the school, but instead, it was met with a silence that felt heavier than the thundering applause I had just witnessed. The next day, however, my decision spiraled into something far more sinister. My phone buzzed incessantly with notifications, but not of support. Instead, my peers turned on me, the whispers and snickers echoing down hallways like a haunting wind, leaving me isolated. I had unleashed something I couldn't contain, a dark curiosity started spreading. Who were these people I once called friends, who pretended loyalty while eagerly stoking the coals of someone else's success? I began to notice strange things around me, my locker mysteriously jammed with an array of sticky notes, taunting me with phrases like just a loser or a standing ovation for Alex. Every morning before first period, there was something new, something that felt eerily tailored just for me, an intelligent push of humiliation that seemed to stalk my every step. That's when I saw the first video, a poorly lit, grainy clip of a group of students huddled together near the library, whispering and pointing at me, hatching conspiracies about my sour grapes and my unpopularity. It made my skin crawl, the realization that I was being hunted, and not for sport, but for fun, twisted their laughter into something monstrous. I tried talking to a teacher, but the weight of my accusations fell flat. They simply encouraged me to turn the other cheek and think positively. But how could I? Those whispers chose me as their entertainment. I knew I couldn't let this go. I began obsessively scrolling through social media, seeking recognition of my turmoil, wondering if others felt it too. I stumbled upon an obscure forum, a shadowy place where school dramas festered and spilled into the digital abyss, a chaotic collection of stories that made mine seem mundane. But buried in that cacophony was a community that thrived on misfortune, a hive intent on exposing what they deemed hidden truths. It was the perfect storm, and I couldn't look away. As weeks turned into months, I became a reluctant participant in this new narrative unfolding, a corner of cyberspace that amplified the vindictive laughter I felt daily. I learned that Alex wasn't just skating by on privilege, he had secrets of his own, and in that forum, I was pushed by an anonymous figure toward the darkest corners of gossip. I started posting about my experiences, disguised through an anonymous handle, weaving a narrative that cast me as the unyielding hero fighting against the corruption. I expected support, but received something unexpected, a raw, visceral acknowledgement of pain. Those who saw my plight echoed it back to me, but the moment I dared to mention Alex's shadowy connections, the laughter morphed into something darker, urging me to dig deeper. Days turned into a fever dream, losing track of what was real and what was a manufactured facade. So, when I finally decided to take action, concocting elaborate schemes to expose Alex, plotting to record him making lewd remarks hidden behind the bathrooms, my sense of moral clarity was long gone. I knew I had crossed a line, but it was intoxicating, like a drug feeding a mania that pulsated through every fiber of my being. Now, even in the dead of night, I would scroll through my phone, glued to what was once my biggest fear, the threat of being unknown, the scorn of being invisible, all black and white images blurring into the chaotic storm that consumed me. Then came the night that everything crashed. In the depths of a swirling digital web, Alex's world collided with mine, and secrets fell like raindrops during a storm. During a party, I confronted him, armed with evidence of his misdeeds, but ended up cornered, outnumbered by his smug entourage. I was desperate, crying out about everything that had been done to me, about the lies and the clenched fists of the school's social hierarchy, but no one cared. They laughed at my anguish, drowning me in a cascade of ridiculing comments and shoves. The weight of humiliation twisted inside me, morphing into something more sinister, until I felt myself reach a breaking point. I don't know what happened next, maybe adrenaline took over or something darker that had been festering inside erupted like a volcano, but in that moment, I snapped. I lunged at Alex, screaming. The throng around us scattered, shocked, but it didn't matter. I felt unstoppable as I threw him against a wall, the sound of his head connecting with the metal locker echoing through the hallway, a warning clap to the mocking audience. As the chaos unfolded around me, blurred by my own rage, I thought about how everything had gotten so out of hand, how a simple school election had turned me from hopeful visionary to deranged antagonist in my own story. From that moment on, I realized I couldn't hide any more from the truth that had chased me simply because I had chosen to be vulnerable. There, in that moment of exposed honesty, I didn't care if it cost me everything. I was done being the side character in someone else's narrative. I've been living with my foster parents for almost 3 years now, and when they first took me in, I felt a flicker of hope after the chaos of my biological family, but that hope quickly fizzled out like a cheap candle. They were nice at first, taking me to parks and letting me choose my favorite meals, but little by little, they began imposing rules that felt suffocating, especially when they decided that they had the right to put parental controls on my iPhone, the one my biological parents gave me before everything went south. That phone was a lifeline. It held pictures of my real mother laughing with me at the beach, messages from my father that said he'd always love me no matter what, and even a few voicemails I kept because they felt like echoes of a past life I couldn't fully remember. When my foster parents broached the subject of parental controls, suggesting it was for my safety, maybe even to protect me from myself after they caught me watching some videos that spiraled into dark territory, I was furious. It felt as if they were digging a grave for my memories, trying to erase everything I had left of my real family. My fists clenched as I remember their voices, calm, yet deceptively firm, telling me it was for my own good. I felt small and powerless as they explained how the internet was a dangerous place, filled with shadows lurking behind every click, as if I'd somehow be safe behind their so-called protective measures. But I'd rather risk it all, dive headfirst into a digital abyss than let them erase the last remnants of my past. I protested, argued, even begged, and when that got me nowhere, I went quiet and resolved to keep my phone a secret from them, using it late at night, crouched under my blanket with the screen dimmed to avoid detection. I fell deeper into the rabbit hole of dark web forums and conspiracy theories, where like-minded souls gathered to share their secrets and fears, convincing myself that they understood the depths of my grief far better than anyone in my foster home ever could. On those sleepless nights, I discovered far more than I ever wanted to know: stories of people who had lost loved ones, tales of sinister disappearances, and whispers of a dark underbelly that thrived in the forgotten corners of the internet. I didn't realize how consumed I was becoming until I encountered a user named Shad0W who claimed he could help people cross over and re-establish contact with the dead using only technology. I was skeptical but intrigued by this account. He had a strange allure, a quiet confidence that drew me in like a moth to a flame. I began engaging with his posts, my curiosity overriding my alarm bells, convinced that maybe, just maybe, there was a way to communicate with my parents again, to hear their voices one last time. Shed0W claimed he needed a special device, the type of thing used in the old ghost hunting shows and a few creepy YouTube channels. I had never considered going beyond my phone, but Shed0W assured me that he had the secrets to make my iPhone a portal, a tether to the world I lost touch with. With his encouragement, I snuck out one moonless night to grab the necessary supplies: a broken radio, a battery pack, and several wires from the old electronics my foster parents tossed out. I felt a thrill run through me as I pieced it together in my room, convinced that while the world saw darkness, I was simply on the brink of a glorious rebirth. As I wrapped the last wire around the makeshift contraption, I felt a jolt of adrenaline. I set everything up, my heart thumping loudly in my chest, hoping this wouldn't just be another wild goose chase. I wanted to believe it would bring me closure. As the clock struck midnight, I opened a chat window with Shad0W, typing frantically, my fingers almost slipping over the screen from the sweat of my anticipation. He told me to make a noise, anything, and focus on the memories I still cherished, the laughter of my real mother and the promises of my father echoing like whispers in my mind. I followed his instructions, my breath hitching as I began to hum a lullaby my mother used to sing. And then, as I held my breath waiting for something, anything, the air around me crackled to life. At first, it was silence, and I thought I was being foolish, but then the radio I'd fashioned let out a high-pitched squeal that made me recoil, and the lights flickered as if responding to my intentions. My phone screen began to blur, the images of my parents rippling like reflections in disturbed water. Suddenly, I heard static, followed by indistinct voices, growing louder and clearer. It was my mother's laughter and my father's deep chuckle weaving together in a painful symphony. I reached out, desperate to bridge the gap, to connect to the only family I'd ever truly felt was mine. As I continued to hum, the voices grew frantic, and an icy chill crawled up my spine, a sense of urgency twisting in my gut. And then, just like that, a voice that wasn't my mother's erupted through the static. "Stop it. Please stop." It was low, plaintive, almost begging, and the warmth of hope quickly twisted into something far more sinister. I felt bile rise in my throat as the tone shifted, becoming furious, accusing me as if it were a vengeful spirit. "You're not supposed to be here." My heart raced, dread pulsing through me as I realized I might have done something horribly wrong, awakening something I could never comprehend. I tried to pull back, to disconnect, but I was paralyzed as shadows began to stretch along the walls, writhing and shifting like dark bile. I could feel their icy breath on the back of my neck, whispers flooding my ears, growing louder. "You're not family. You're not family." Fleeing into panic, I threw my phone across the room, shattering the fragile link, the echoes of their fury clawing at my skin. The shadows receded, leaving nothing but an oppressive silence, but the scar of that encounter would never vanish. I stumbled into the living room in a haze, my heart still pounding as I faced my foster parents, who woke up alarmed by the commotion. Their eyes widened as they saw me, trembling and wide-eyed, and for the first time, I felt the weight of their concern, genuine and terrified, yet I could hardly stand it. They immediately gathered around me, asking questions I didn't know how to answer, probing for an explanation of what had transpired in the dark corners of my mind. I wanted to scream that it wasn't my fault, that I had desperately sought solace and instead summoned only trouble, but the words stuck in my throat. The fear in their eyes stung like 1,000 needles, and just like that, I realized I had no choice. I had insulted my own reality, tearing apart the fragile threads of stability they had attempted to weave around me. As they held me, their warmth was suffocating instead of comforting. It only reminded me of the loss, the real family lost in shadows and confusion. I didn't want them probing deeper. I didn't want to tell them what happened. But that night turned from chaos to something else. It morphed into quiet nights full of investigations into my behavior, full of therapy openness and communication strategies over therapy sessions. They came to discover the extent of my misadventures on the internet and decided to enforce parental controls, the very thing I had fought against, drowning me in an irony bitter enough to make me sick. With each layer they placed on my phone, I felt not protected, but restrained, confined within the walls of their good intentions, a prisoner to their version of safety. My biological family was gone and unreplaceable, and somehow, my foster family turned from bastions of hope into an extension of confinement. I began to wonder, AITA, for trying to cling to the last pieces of my past, for wanting a connection that, as the dreadful echoes of that night reminded me, perhaps ought to remain severed, void of voices calling from the dark. I used to think conflicts in marriage were easy to resolve. After all, how hard could it be to express your feelings about something that's bothering you? But that was before the Fruit Loops incident, the night everything changed between my husband Eric and me. It began innocently enough. I was exhausted after a long day at work, and as I shuffled into the kitchen, I spotted Eric happily indulging in a massive bowl of cereal, the artfully vibrant loop smothered in milk, his face illuminated by the glow of the fridge light. I greeted him with a smile, expecting just a quiet moment to connect after a hectic day, but the atmosphere soured when I saw he already had a second bowl prepared, as if realizing he'd need it to satiate some insatiable hunger I didn't even know he had. My initial amusement turned to annoyance as he spooned a heaping helping into his mouth, the sound of the cereal crunching echoing in the dimly lit kitchen, like a cruel remix of my own spiraling frustration. "Are you really going to eat that much?" I asked, trying to inject a hint of humor into my comment, but Eric shot me a glare that poured ice down my spine. "What? It's just cereal," he replied, voice tinged with defensiveness as if I'd accused him of committing heinous acts. It struck me that maybe, just maybe, I was overreacting, so I shrugged it off and made myself a much smaller bowl, but the unease lingered like a ghost I couldn't shake. I sat across from him, and we could barely look at each other as the silence stretched, punctuated only by the clinking of spoons and slurping milk, hollow reminders of our widening disconnect. Trying to break the suffocating tension, I suggested we talk about our days, sharing a story about a coworker's mishap that had everyone in stitches, but Eric nodded in response, his focus unwavering from the bowl as if I were speaking an entirely different language. I could feel rage bubbling beneath my skin, a helplessness morphing into something primal, and I couldn't help but feel he was deliberately ignoring me. Finally, in a moment of clarity wrapped in a shroud of frustration, I blurted out, "It's kind of selfish to hog all the cereal, you know." Silence ensued. Eric's spoon clattered against the bowl, the sound sending a shockwave through my chest. "Selfish? You think eating a bowl of cereal makes me selfish?" he asked incredulously, his voice rising, anger twisting his features into something I almost didn't recognize. I was tired. "Just because I want to enjoy my food doesn't mean I'm putting myself before you." The atmosphere became thick with unsaid words. I felt a reservoir of tears threaten to spill over, and I wasn't sure why I felt so shut out. My unease blossomed into outright confusion because it was just cereal, wasn't it? What did it even mean when we hurled accusations back and forth like cold cuts at a deli, the oddity of the situation spiraling toward an absurd conclusion? "You're making a big deal out of nothing, Eric," spat, indignant, and for a fleeting second, his ire glanced off my armor of hurt. Perhaps I was making a mountain out of a molehill. But then came a wave of bitterness that I couldn't ignore. Wasn't this about more than Fruit Loops? It was about our relationship, the chasm that had grown between us, countless nights of silence more poignant than words, several missed connections disguised as life's daily grind. I felt utterly alone in my desire to bridge that gap, a rhythmic pulse pounding in my ears as he continued to scoff at my words, chewing through each syllable as if they were the very cereal he deemed more important than our conversation. The bowl became a battleground as I accused him of being neglectful, focusing on superficial things instead of the underlying issues that screamed for attention. "If I can't even talk to you about our basic needs, who am I to share my life with you?" I felt raw, exposed, like a creature caught in the harsh light of his casual apathy, but he refused to budge, scoffing as he dug into another helping, the brightly colored pieces swimming in milk, blissfully unaware of the maelstrom of emotions swirling just a few inches away. I got up, slammed my bowl in the sink, and stomped toward our bedroom, where the weight of my words loomed over me. I slumped against the door, trying to catch my breath as I felt the tears tumble down my cheeks. Am I the entitled one here? The nagging voice inside me echoed as guilt washed over like a tidal wave. But rather than reflecting on my own pain, I wondered if he could truly remain indifferent while the world burned around him. This was more than cereal. It was the way he could eat so blithely while ignoring the hollow sounds of our lives barely touched by intimacy. Hours passed, my thoughts spiraled until they felt tangible, raw like a wound, and when I heard the soft patter of his footsteps creeping toward our bedroom, I thought maybe we could reconcile. But instead, Eric stood at the threshold, and before I could even summon a calm demeanor, he mumbled something unintelligible that sounded much like an apology but felt entirely hollow, just a way to end the night without earnestness. I could see it in the way he avoided eye contact, shame shimmering briefly only to collapse under the weight of his pride. I muttered something back, words soaked in resentment, and, in that moment, in that oh-so-ordinary kitchen illuminated with memories and the smell of fading milk, I realized this dinner was more than a bowl of cereal. It had come to symbolize everything gnawing at us beneath the surface, the inability to dig deeper, the hesitance to face what was truly wrong. I lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling, allowing exhaustion to wash over me, yet sleep eluded as I replayed the events of the night like a reel in slow motion. In that ache of solitude, I understood something crucial. It wasn't about cereal anymore, it was about feeling unseen. The next morning was a chilly void of unspoken words. You could cut the tension with a knife as neither of us acknowledged what had transpired. Eric settled back into his routine, stepping lightly with precise purpose, brewing coffee while I poured cereal, determining to trudge forward despite the weight of resentment. Should I have bitten my tongue? Should I have just let him indulge? But beneath that question lurked a deeper one: was I wrong for wanting recognition? Days turned into weeks, and while practical matters continued as they always did, I felt the shift, how we danced around each other more carefully, like two actors performing in a play where the audience was unaware of the tension building offstage. I found solace in the quiet of night when I could replay our childish skirmish, flesh and blood memories tinged with bitterness, wondering if we were just prolonging the inevitable, forcing ourselves through to the end of a dull script. And then, one evening, as I flicked through Netflix in a desperate bid to create a new shared experience, I offered to make dinner. Maybe my gesture would be perceived as an olive branch. But after gathering ingredients and cooking a meal for two, I hesitantly beckoned Eric to our table, fiery lights dancing against the walls, and proposed we eat together instead of watching another episode without so much as a glance or a word exchanged. He looked up, reluctance flickering across his face as he joined me, but the table was a quiet battlefield once again, simmering words lingering in the corners of our postures. I couldn't hold back the flood anymore, all those hidden truths threatening to explode, the silence we'd sustained too long wrapped around our throats. You know, I called you selfish for a reason because you're not the only one hurting here, I said, heart racing, pouring out my frustration, and finally giving way to the aching loneliness I felt. His brow furrowed as if I had disturbed some old, long-buried pain. When he finally spoke, it was in a whisper laced with vulnerability. I didn't mean to shut you out. I thought Fruit Loops would fill a void. I didn't realize I had created another. In that moment, I understood what we'd both been trying to stave off: the hurt, the apathy, the mounting discontent. But what terrified me more than the fight over a bowl of cereal was the recognition that maybe the things we felt compelled to fight over were only reflections of the storms brewing beneath the surface. And that night, instead of cereal becoming our destruction, it transformed into something unexpected, an offering of understanding, a chance to heal the wounds left festering in the shadows. We each took a slice of the truth, and through the darkness, the glow of hope started to dance in the periphery, a tiny flicker promising that even the smallest battles could become the beginning of something new. And as we sat there, spooning in unison, I realized sometimes it takes a bowl of cereal to really see each other again. I never thought I'd be that guy who gets grossed out by his girlfriend, but here I am, sitting in my dimly lit bedroom, heart racing and palms sweaty, wondering if I'm overreacting or if there's something genuinely disturbing about the situation. My girlfriend, Lisa, is the kind of woman who could light up a room with her laughter. She's bright, funny, and has this magnetic smile that drew me in the moment we met at that dive bar last summer. But lately, something else has been drawing my attention, and it's not as pleasant as her charm. It started small. She'd skip washing her hair for a day or two, saying she liked the natural oils or didn't want to ruin her waves, but after a few weeks, it became clear to me that this was more than just a beauty routine, it was an outright neglect. I hesitated, thinking maybe it was a phase or some personal statement she was making about embracing herself, but by week 3, I couldn't ignore the pungent odor that lingered in the air after she left the room. It was like the smell of damp earth mixed with something rancid, and I tried to brush it off as a trivial inconvenience. We'd hang out at my place, and out of desperation, I would spray air freshener when she wasn't looking, hoping she'd catch a whiff and feel compelled to wash up, but instead, she just kept piling on the dry shampoo, like it was some magical solution. One night, we were on the couch, cuddling while watching a movie, and I caught a whiff that made me gag, subtle but thick enough to linger, and I couldn't help but pull away. The look she gave me was one of confusion and hurt, as if I had slapped her across the face, and that was the moment I knew I had to say something. "Lisa, can we talk?" I started, my voice barely above a whisper. "I think you need to wash your hair more often." I braced myself for a fight, but instead of anger, she just laughed, that carefree laughter that had enchanted me so many times, now tinged with disbelief. "You're kidding, right? It's just hair. Who cares?" But I could see her self-assurance crack a little, the laughter not reaching her eyes. The days turned into weeks, each one more unbearable than the last. As we spent time together, her hair became a distressing presence. It was always stringy and looked like it was home to a family of grease rats. I felt disgusting just sitting next to her. Friends and family began to notice too, dropping pointed hints that couldn't go unaddressed. At dinner, my sister casually asked, "Are you okay, Lisa? You're not looking your best lately." I felt that crushing embarrassment swell in my chest, the ball of conflict growing larger every time I pulled Lisa close. One night after work, I walked into our apartment, fully ready to be hit by that noxious cloud she now carried like a perfume, but what greeted me was oddly still. The whole place felt off balance, eerily quiet, and I immediately feared the worst. I wandered through the dim light, finding her bedroom door slightly ajar. I nudged it open, revealing the bed a mess of clothes and crumbs, but no Lisa. A sickening knot formed in my stomach as I turned to check the bathroom. The moment I stepped inside, reality twisted in a sickening way. The mirror was fogged up, and her hairbrush sat abandoned on the countertop, but where was she? The thought struck me like a lightning bolt that maybe she'd finally cracked. I found myself pacing the room, mind spiraling with worries, until I noticed the open window, and then I remembered something. She had mentioned a friend down the street hosting an art exhibit that night, so I grabbed my coat and rushed out, panic driving my feet. Arriving at the gallery, the vibrant colors painted walls contrasted sharply with the raw anxiety gnawing at my insides. I scanned the crowd, searching for her face, but found only strangers chatting and sipping wine. A wave of unease crashed over me. Where could she have gone? Just as I was about to text her, something deep within me prompted me to check the restroom. I pushed through the throng of bodies moving like a tide toward the bar, and as I reached the flickering light of the restroom sign, my breath caught in my throat. I could hear muffled laughter from inside, and I paused, my heart pounding. Forcing the door open, I stepped inside, and there she was, standing in front of the sink, her hair splayed out like a tangled mess, a friend from work, Jennifer, beside her. They both stopped laughing when they saw me, and the moment of silence hung heavy in the air, thick with all the things left unsaid. I stood frozen, my mouth working but unable to form words. "What's wrong, babe?" Lisa said, tugging a strand of greasy hair behind her ear, the innocence in her voice cutting deeper than any knife. My thoughts raced as I looked back and forth between the two of them. There was something unsettling about the way they were giggling, the way Lisa couldn't seem to feel the weight of the revolting crust forming on her scalp. Then Jennifer leaned closer and whispered something that sent chills racing down my spine. "It's only hair, right? It's like art, the messier, the better." Just like that, panic morphed into a visceral horror, and I stumbled backward, suddenly understanding that this wasn't a phase, this wasn't just about hygiene, but something far more sinister I hadn't grasped. An hour passed, and I was sitting outside, shivering not from the chill of the night, but the creeping realization that I couldn't be with someone who had willingly chosen to let themselves go so profoundly. I could hear the muffled noise behind me, laughter ringing out, but it all felt distant, strange. What kind of life did I want? Was I disgusted because I actually thought she was disgusting, or was my disgust a reflection of my own expectations of normalcy? When I went home that night, I tried to shake it off, but all I could think was that I felt trapped in a relationship that had dove deep into the abyss, her carefree attitude now looming over me like a shadow, leaving me pondering how far I would have to go to escape this tangled mess of love and revulsion. I texted her, "We need to talk," and waited, the screen flashing with those 3 little dots, and when she finally replied, it felt like the exhale I'd been holding for too long. "Can we talk about your hair?" I typed, my fingers trembling, but the response came quickly, and all at once, I wondered if it was really worth it to try and salvage what was left of us. AITA for being disgusted that my girlfriend doesn't wash her hair for weeks. The loneliness devoured me, as I realized I was getting sucked into the whirlpool of our differences, fighting with a growing sense of dread that maybe, just maybe, I'd be forced to choose between love and a life governed by a cleanliness I once took for granted. I never thought I'd have to justify teaching my daughter the importance of sleep, but the day I found myself sprawled across the living room floor, heart racing and eyes wide open, was when I realized everyone views the world through their own lens, even my 8-year-old. It started innocently enough. Mia was a bright, curious kid who preferred late-night readathons over the weaknesses of sleep. She'd marathon Magic Tree House stories until the early morning hours, and it didn't help that her school started later in the day. I was worried, of course, but I never thought her nightly habit could twist into something darker until I started seeing the whispered shadows creeping around our home late at night, at first, mere figments of my imagination, a trick of the moonlight. But soon, I began to hear them too, soft whispers in the dark, grating against my sanity like nails on a chalkboard. They'd slither around my ears and seep into my dreams, taunting me with secrets that rattled my bones. I tried talking to Mia about how her late-night escapades were weaving a web of sleeplessness, but how could I compete with the enchanting stories she conjured in her imagination? One evening, desperate for a solution, I devised a plan. I would create a reward system for her to go to bed on time, embellishing it with the promise of being more energized and focused during the day. I thought I had struck gold when she eagerly agreed, all while those shadows shrieked in amusement, relishing in my naivete. The first few nights were a struggle as Mia cried for her books, but eventually, she started accepting her new bedtime. It all peaked when I noticed the whispers still darting around me, telling me it was too late to reverse everything, that maybe I should let her stay awake so they could find her, an absurd thought that sent a wave of anxiety crashing over me. One night, the tension reached its breaking point. I had just finished reading to her instead of the usual bedtime story. It was a thrilling old fairy tale, a diversion from my own creeping dread, almost lulling me into a trance as I tucked her in. But as I did, I saw the shadows cast onto her wall, impossibly long and grotesque, almost resembling hands trying to grab her. It was ridiculous, terrifying even, yet mesmerizing. My heart pounded in rhythm to the whispers, the urgency palpable in the air. "She must stay awake, join us," they seemed to chant. I flipped on the nightlight, banishing the darkness to its corners, and she squeaked out a frightened "Daddy, are they coming for me?" My laughter cut through the air, a desperate attempt to cloak what I felt was creeping closer, but there was no hiding my terror from her wide, unsettling eyes. I spent the night monitoring her, a pit of dread building as I realized the whispers had become frantic, feverishly relentless, urging me to let my daughter know she was safe, but I felt increasingly uncertain of my own sanity. That was my breaking point, and in an act of desperation, I whisked her away and enrolled her in a sleep training program I had read about online. They said it would teach her both the importance of sleep and ensure restful nights. But the horrified look in Mia's eyes, begging me not to leave her during our first session, tore me apart. Yet I pressed on, my mind firmly convinced it was for her own good, for a small sense of normalcy. Sessions churned into weeks, and while Mia took her lessons to heart, I was left spiraling deeper into sleepless desperation. Each night felt longer, and the whispers invested more time in raking my mind over the coals of dread. "She doesn't need you, she'll choose to join us soon." It haunted my dreams, transforming her laughter into disturbing echoes as I tossed and turned in worry. I desperately reached out to other parents, but in our social media group, my pleas were met with laughter. "Come on, it's just sleep. You are not being called to join the Sandman," they chuckled, but each laugh cut deeper until their amusement morphed into derision. Before long, they had tagged me as the overprotective dad who couldn't let go, further isolating me. I deployed strategies I'd learned in my own sleep-deprived state, led by what they advised rather than what felt right. I pushed her limits, enforced rules, and even barricaded her bedroom door with pillows, a move that causes waves of shame to ripple through me now. That night, the shadows slipped under her door, engulfing my household, murmuring vehemently, and I swear I could see them reaching for her. Tina, my wife, had long since given up. To her, Mia's sleep rebellion had graduated into another anecdote from a baffling father. I could hear her whisper late at night, "You're being overbearing," but every absence of sleep kept straining at my desperation. One fateful evening, the whispers crescendoed, echoing through the walls, and in a moment of sheer terror, I rushed into Mia's bedroom. The room was dim, illuminated by the pale glow of the moon spilling through her window, and there was Mia, soundlessly sleeping, but the voices screamed louder, almost erupting from the very corners of the room. She must choose, she must choose. In an act of panic and fear, I picked her up, shaking her awake, shouted for her to get up. "It's important she stays alert," but my wide-eyed daughter crumpled in protest, her face stricken with fear. I was thrust into the horror unfolding before me. The shadows coiled tighter around me as I cradled her, horrified at how they began to flicker in the corner of my vision. They wanted her. In an all-consuming frenzy, I dropped her back on her bed and slammed the door shut, gasping for breath as if I had disrupted an ancient ritual. Had I doomed us both? The next morning was met with a silence that pinched my conscience, and when I approached Mia's room, I found it empty. My heart plummeted, 1,000 terrified thoughts racing through my mind. I dashed through the house, frantically searching, but the only noise that greeted me was the echo of my breath against the walls. It was then that I remembered the voices saying they would wait. Her door creaked open, and I felt their presence encircle me, still lingering like an unshakable chill. I tore back to where the shadows had taken me, and my hands fumbled to pull open the old closet door, revealing only impenetrable darkness, and there was Mia, but caught in a trance, a pitiful expression on her face. I would pay any price to pull her from that abyss, back into my arms where she belonged. When she returned to me moments later, her eyes focused once more, I held back my tears. It was all my fault. I had taken away the only shield she had against the shadows, her bedtime stories that filled our lives with imagination and warmth. As I cradled her, I made a decision. I would let her have her stories once more, even if it meant I could never truly sleep again. The importance of sleep suddenly became the echoes that trailed behind us, a gentle reminder of what dreams truly held. Though I still yearn for quiet nights, I realize the cost of my lessons was far too high. Am I the jerk for trying to teach my daughter the importance of sleep, or have I simply opened a door I can never close again? When my friend Sarah made the comment about my girlfriend Lisa being the token Asian, I felt the air grow thick with tension, as if someone had just whispered dark secrets in a crowded room, every eye quickly averting to look anywhere but at me. We were at a bar, surrounded by laughter and chatter, the kind of casual Friday night that usually brought the best out of people, but suddenly I felt like I was trapped in a scene of a horror movie where something sinister lurked just beneath the surface. I glanced at Lisa, who had been animatedly discussing her passion for pottery before Sarah's comments disrupted her flow, and her smile faded, replaced by a mask of confusion and hurt that twisted my stomach into knots. It was as if a storm had swept through, leaving only the debris of my friend's thoughtlessness behind, and I could sense anger rising in me, a primal reaction against the ignorance that seemed to lace Sarah's words. "What the hell did you just say?" I shot back, my voice a little louder than I intended, drawing the attention of nearby patrons who peered up from their drinks, eyes wide as they waited for the unfolding drama. The uncomfortable silence that enveloped our table felt electric, but I refused to let Sarah dismiss this as a joke, a little quip in what was supposed to be a friendly gathering. "You can't just say those things," I continued, heart pounding, the heat of embarrassment and rage pulsing through me, imagining Lisa's discomfort as if it were my own, the disbelief on her face cutting me deeper than any knife. Sarah's face turned a shade of red that echoed the shame she clearly wasn't feeling as she sputtered out a defense that made the situation worse, insisting she was just being funny and that I was overreacting. I thought about how Lisa had shared stories of her battles against subtle racism and microaggressions, the times she'd struggled to be seen as more than just a stereotype, and I realized in that moment that this wasn't just about a careless remark, it was about the ways society reduced people to labels and jokes that cut deeper than anyone could imagine. A palpable tension hung thick between us, as Sarah's entourage murmured awkwardly, clearly caught between wanting to support her and acknowledging that what she said was deeply out of line. I turned to Lisa, who was now looking down at her untouched drink, the smile that used to brighten her face replaced by an expression of disappointment, making my heart ache for her, wishing I could shield her from the ignorance I deemed unworthy of a real friend. When I shot Sarah a glare that must have conveyed 1,000 unsaid words, I noticed a flicker of realization cross her face, perhaps a brief moment where she understood the gravity of her insensitivity, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. In a desperate attempt to reclaim the joviality of the evening, she tried to laugh it off, cracking a joke that fell flat in the thick air between us, but I could see the hints of defensiveness edging back into her demeanor, and I realized that this was more than a simple misunderstanding. It was a window into the fractures of our friendship laid bare, like a raw wound festering under the guise of normalcy. I didn't want to confront her pride at the expense of my relationship with Lisa, but I couldn't sit there and pretend it didn't happen either. The evening curled into a ball of chaos, laughter replaced by awkward shifting in seats, as everyone seemed to tiptoe around me and Lisa, waiting for fallout that hung over us like dark clouds. I remember feeling the flame of anger cool slightly, churning into something deeper, a fierce protective instinct taking root in my chest, compelling me to stand up for Lisa not just because she was my girlfriend, but because she deserved to exist in a world that appreciated her complexity, her beauty, her cultural identity, rather than dismissing her as a punchline. "It's not a joke if it hurts someone else," I finally said, my voice softening but laced with steel, drawing Lisa's eyes toward mine, and in that pregnant silence, I watched as a shared understanding dawned on her face, a flicker of gratitude that made all the chaos worthwhile. Sarah huffed, her demeanor shifting from defensive to wounded, and I caught sight of tears brimming at the edges of her eyes, but I wasn't here to soothe her guilt, I was here to advocate for the woman I loved, and that was my priority until my last breath. The confrontation caught everyone off guard, turning their drinks into props in a tragic play unfolding right before them, and I thought about how desperately we cling to the comfort of ignorance, how the need to be liked sometimes makes us forget our humanity. The conversation wended onward, but it was clear that something had shifted irreparably. We finished our drinks and left, Lisa and I walking in silence through the night air that felt heavier than it had moments ago, but also liberating, as if in confronting the harsh absurdities of our reality, we unearthed a bond far deeper than I had imagined we were capable of sharing. As we reached the car, I could sense a beautiful understanding forging between us, and I dared to hope it might be a step towards healing the bruises that had marked both our hearts and our interactions in a world where sometimes, standing up means stepping away from the toxic comfort of friendship for the sake of love. I'm writing this because I'm terrified, and I need to share my story before it consumes me. It all started innocently enough. My mother-in-law, Diane, was a well-meaning woman, or at least, that's what I kept telling myself in the years we spent feigning cordiality while navigating her unpredictable rages. A few weeks before her death, when she was confined to a hospital bed after a sudden heart attack, she let slip her plans for her will. We sat there, my husband and I, sipping weak coffee in that sterile waiting room, our expressions shifting from bored to tense as she rambled on about the 5 timeshares she insisted were a gift from the heart. 5 timeshares, 1 in the Bahamas, 2 in the Smoky Mountains, and 2 in Oregon, all racking up an eye-watering total of $9,500 in annual fees. We had explicitly told her we couldn't maintain such burdens, especially since we were trying to stabilize our own lives after the pandemic, but she had become a different person. In her fevered state, she grew angry, her voice rising until the monitors beeped in protest, spitting out an array of frantic notes, and as they moved to stabilize her, I felt something shift in the air. We lost her a day later, and with her went those ominous plans like a dark storm cloud hovering over us. When we gathered with the family days later to read the will, her attorney handed over a neatly typed paper outlining her loving gifts. I felt the blood drain from my face as I scanned the page, but as I looked around the room, none of my in-laws seemed to flinch. Their expressions were almost gleeful, like they were satisfied with her eccentric logic. I turned to my husband, gauging his reaction, but he was silent, a muscle twitching at his jaw. That's when I felt my gut twist. Did they know something I didn't? I brushed it off, thinking that maybe this was her outrageous way of keeping us tied to her legacy. Yet, as the days passed, keeping up with anonymous letter after letter from the timeshare companies demanding payment, I began to feel something lurking in the shadows. The first sign I noticed was at our doorstep, a heavy package wrapped in a dark, coated paper with no return address. I opened it to find an ominous leather binder embossed with an insignia I didn't recognize, a serpent intertwining with a skull, each letter ominously fading into the worn edges. Inside, an old photograph showed timeshares with figures that looked hauntingly familiar. My heart raced as I flipped through, affirmation of Diane's haunting grip still latching onto us, grinning maliciously through the ages. I felt the chill of unseen eyes, and it escalated to a weekly affliction. Every Monday, more packages arrived, and with them, an ever-deepening dread. They held strange notes, requests that revealed an unsettling trend. Each note dished out threats about some familial pact that had gone unfulfilled, with instructions no one could decipher. It claimed that we would own not only the timeshares, but also their dark histories, leading us to confront shattered memories of the past I didn't know I was connected to. My husband became a shell of who he was, slowly deteriorating under the pressure of family whispers, and it broke my heart to watch as he no longer found solace in our home. We fought more, and nights devolved into silence as we each lay awake, haunted. Then, one night while unpacking a new round of letters, I stumbled upon something even darker, a crudely drawn map with arrows leading to the bases of the timeshare properties, each one marked with an X. As I studied it, the atmosphere in the room thickened, and I could hear my husband yelling at something invisible. He was in a fit, begging for whatever dark presence to leave us alone as he drew back into that despondent spiral. I watched in horror as the glow around him dimmed. Suddenly, he wasn't himself anymore. The land where we thought we would craft memories had begun to consume us, revealing secrets that had long lingered in the shadows. We tried cutting ties, but the letters became more menacing, each threatening paragraph ushering in a new realm of despair. Then came the nightmares. They were vivid, bringing echoes of Diane standing at the edge of a storm-lashed beach, her laughter twisted and echoing as though she enjoyed watching us writhe in agony, and each night, it felt like we were being pulled into an abyss where neither of us could escape. My husband grew distant, wrapped in unfathomable darkness until one evening I woke up to find him gone. Panic set in as I searched everywhere, only to find the door ajar, leading to the open night air where the moon hung heavy. It was at that moment I realized he had become entrapped in the very thing Diane had left us, a cursed possession disguised as a gift. I ran toward the beach as fear surged through me, and at the water's edge, I caught sight of him standing there, entranced by something in the distance. I screamed, but the waves drowned me out, and by the time I reached him, his eyes were glazed over, filled with a stirring malice that raised my hair and froze my breath. It wasn't him anymore, it was something sinister wearing his skin as the ground trembled beneath me. I stumbled back, realizing that Diane's gift was more than financial, it was an unholy legacy. Now, every time a package arrives, every whisper from our family or sighting at our doorstep sends chills washing over me. I can't tell what's real anymore, and as the letters demand my husband's soul, I feel the tide rise, cleaving our fates, one letter at a time. So here I am, terrified and alone, begging for someone to believe me, drowning in the legacy she intended for us, an inheritance of which we never asked. But now it feels like we've entered an irrevocable deal with the dead, and each passing day, I fear I will wake up at the water's edge and find him gone forever, consumed by the darkness, forever tangled in the serpent's embrace.